In this video, we are going to discuss the classical approximation and degrees of freedom for large systems of particles. I'm going to go a bit fast through the classical approximation stuff, just because while it's important because it underlies pretty much everything we're going to talk about, it's not vital to understanding how to do thermodynamics. So in the classical approximation, we want to think about the fact that when we're talking about particles, what we're really talking about are quantum mechanical systems. So for a system with n particles, the Schrödinger equation is this right here. And this h here, this is our Hamiltonian operator that has a kinetic energy and a potential energy term on it. Where here in our potential energy term, we have this r sub ij, where that is the distance between particle I and particle j, where particle I will have some position in three-dimensional space. For each particle, we then need to add another set of variables and then sum over the particle pairs. This obviously becomes extremely complex with the number of interactions going to n times n minus 1 over 2, where we can see that if n is something on the order of Avogadro's number, this becomes quite large indeed. Luckily, quantum effects only dominate at the very small scales on the order of an angstrom, and so we can approximate the positions and trajectories of atoms and molecules classically and still obtain correct answers. Classical systems are composed of particles with definite positions and momenta, their time evolution governed by deterministic laws, so like the Newtonian physics. We consider the atom the fundamental particle, so we aren't going to talk about things like electrons and protons and things like that. Each atom has a definite position r and momentum, so we don't need to worry about Heisenberg uncertainty. Interactions between atoms are described by the potential energy function that depends on the positions but not the momenta of all the atoms. The potential is an approximation of the lowest ground state energy that would be found by solving the Schrödinger equation for the electron wave function given fixed positions of the nuclei. So we can think about it this way. If we have a particle here, then it has this potential function around it that drops off as 1 over r squared. So if we end up with something like 5 particles in our system, then we would end up with 10 different interactions going. So each particle is interacting with every other particle. So given this formula right here, even for just 5 particles, we end up with 10 different interactions. Again, if we have a number of particles on the order of a mole, that's going to be a lot more interactions. We can use the gradient of the potential function for the forces acting on each atom. So we're just taking the gradient of our potential here. So that's just the change in the gradient with the change in position. Given the position-dependent forces, the time evolution of the system is deterministic and described by Newton's second law. So that's the mass here times the acceleration, which is just the second derivative of position with respect to time, and that equals the force. Or alternatively, the change in momentum with respect to time. The total energy is given by the classical Hamiltonian, which is the sum of the potential and kinetic energy of all the atoms. So that looks like this right here. Conservation of energy says that the Hamiltonian adopts a constant value during the system's time evolution. So in other words, the kinetic energy plus the potential energy of the entire system is not going to change, which means that for an isolated system, we can only have kinetic being converted into potential or potential converted into kinetic. It's not going to lose or gain energy from the surroundings, or energy is not going to be created nor destroyed. We can show that the Hamiltonian is independent of time, which again is just to say that it's conserved, by doing a bunch of math here, which I'm not going to go through. You can look through it yourself, but this is the result right here, that the change in the Hamiltonian with respect to time ends up being equal to 0, which again is just the mathematical way of talking about the conservation of energy. Our most important aspect of the classical description is the potential, which takes all the atomic positions and returns an energy due to the interactions. We therefore are tasked with finding an accurate form of the potential. This is often divided into bonded and non-bonded interactions. So the potentials are due to the following. So if we look at a molecule like this, we can have the bending of bond angles. So they call it waggling, where these things are sort of scissoring back and forth. We also have repulsive and dispersive forces. So even within a large molecule like this chlorine and this methyl group could be interacting with each other. In organic chemistry, we call that things like steric hindrance. We also have things like bond stretching. So this chlorine could be bouncing up and down like it's on a spring, and that we call a harmonic oscillator. We also have electrostatics. So again, that's similar to our steric forces. We also have torsion. So we could have like this methyl group here swiveling around on this sigma bond, and so that will have different energies. So again, in organic chemistry, you may have seen like the Newman projections, where you have the eclipsed and Gauss conformations. So that is going to have different energies depending on the dihedral angle of the atoms on either side of the bond. So in this case, like this hydrogen and this carbon right here. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So our non-bonded interactions are things like the electrostatics, which is given by Coulomb's law, the van der Waals attractions. So these are the instantaneous electron densities surrounding two atoms, often with the form of U equals C over this R to the 6th power, where C is just some constant that depends on the elements and chemical environment. We also have short-range repulsion, so this pushes two atoms apart when they get too close and has a similar form of the van der Waals attraction. So it's given by this C over this R to the M power, where M is going to be greater than 6. So we saw in the van der Waals attraction M is equal to 6. In the short-range repulsions, it's greater than 6. And so we often use what's called a Leonard-Jones potential, where we set this one equal to negative 12 here. So you'll notice this is negative, where up here we said it was positive. That's just because we are taking the inverse of this right here. So the sigma represents the C. Now we're putting the R on top. But this is the Leonard-Jones potential, and that looks like this, where we can see when we get very close, this R to the negative 12 starts to dominate, and this shoots up very quickly. Whereas when we are over here, then the negative 6 will dominate more, and so we end up going towards this 0, where we have this equilibrium spot at this R sub M here, and that's kind of the distance that two atoms are going to want to get to each other. Where we say this epsilon here, which shows up in our Leonard-Jones potential right there, and sigma, which are the two constants right here, are constants which depend on the types of atoms involved. And then the 4 that shows up right here ensures that the minimum value of the potential is this negative epsilon right here. The attractive force, like I said, is given by the R to the negative 6, so that's dominating over here, so we see that it's going to attract. They're going to get closer as it goes down into this well, where repulsion is this R to the negative 12, where that's if we're trying to get even closer, this is going to be repelling us. So if we get to this point right here, then repulsion will start winning out and it will push the particle away. So it wants to sit in this potential well right here. Then we have the bonded interactions. So we have the bond stretching. That's that spring action I mentioned before. So this is given by U equals A times D minus D naught squared, where D is the length of the bond and A and D naught are constants. Bond stretching is fairly high energy, and so in most cases it doesn't actually occur until quite high temperatures. We talked more about that in video 10 on this playlist. Each stretch adds 2 degrees of freedom to the heat capacity, so one for kinetic energy and one for potential energy. Bond angle bending, or wagging as it's often called, is often given as U equals B times theta minus theta naught squared, where theta is the bond angle and B and theta naught are constants. Bond angle bending happens at lower temperatures, within room temperature range. Each bending mode contributes kinetic and potential energy components to the degrees of freedom. Then bond torsions are energies of rotation around a sigma bond and are often given by this right here. So this is a cosine function, where omega is the torsional angle. Bond torsions can happen at very low temperatures, and so are often the most significant contributors to heat capacity in large organic molecules. The larger and more complex a molecule is, the higher its molar heat capacity, or the amount of thermal energy needed to increase 1 mole of substance by 1 Kelvin, but often the lower in its specific heat, which is the amount of thermal energy needed to increase 1 gram of substance by 1 Kelvin. So for instance, heptane has dozens of bending and stretching modes. So we can see the molecule here, we can have bends and stretches going on at each one of these bonds here. And so its molar heat capacity at constant pressure is quite large, so around 166 joules per mole Kelvin at 298 Kelvin. And that's because it has a lot of degrees of freedom into which to put energy. Helium, on the other hand, has 0 internal modes, so it's just a single atom like this. There are no bonds to bend or stretch, and so its molar heat capacity at constant pressure is much smaller, at 20.79 joules per mole Kelvin at all temperatures. And the reason this is at all temperatures, as we saw in video 10, is because it doesn't have those internal degrees of freedom, so it doesn't have any stretches in particular which can actually be activated at higher temperatures. However, if you have 1 gram of each, then helium, which has a specific heat of 5.19 joules per gram Kelvin, will win on specific heat because there are so many more helium atoms in a gram of helium than there are heptane molecules, which has a specific heat of 1.66 joules per gram Kelvin. So for instance, we can actually look at it this way. If we have 1 gram of heptane, then we have 6.01 times 10 to the 21 molecules of heptane. But if we have 1 gram of helium, then we have 1.50 times 10 to the 23 atoms of helium. So if we divide those, we find that there's about 25 times more helium atoms than heptane molecules in 1 gram of each of those substances. And so because we have so many more helium atoms, there is so much more energy in the form of that kinetic energy from the translations, and so we end up with a lot more degrees of freedom. But anyway, that was everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope you found that helpful, and I will see you in the next one.